Hey guys, welcome back. All right, we're talking about Paul today. I'm not sure how this is going to go. I didn't really have time to write out notes for this video. I'm basically going to provide some of the scriptures that are in the book. If you want to see this firsthand, it's in chapter 8, and I think it's the third section called Scrutinizing Paul. And you can read it word for word. That's basically what I'm going to be doing today, is just kind of pulling it up and having it on screen and just going by some of the points that are in the book. It's going to have all the same scriptures, but so we'll see how this goes. I know it's going to be a two-part series because it's a long section, and but I think it's going to be interesting because I have a lot of friends who are pro-Paul and a lot of friends who are anti-Paul. And as far as my vegan friends, my biblical vegan friends or biblical plant-based vegetarian friends, I don't really know where everybody stands. I know some people, it's the same way. I know some people who probably lean towards him being a legitimate apostle, and others that would say no. So the focus of this study isn't really about whether he's legit or not. It's we just want to see what his position was on the flesh eating. And I think the guy is flaky when it comes to that. And we're going to see why. We're going to go over a few verses because sometimes it does appear that he is anti-flesh eating, and other times he's like, have at it, just watch who you're around when you do it. It's so you'll kind of get that feeling when you look at some of the things that Paul said in his letters. Okay. And the first thing I wanted to point out is that he says in one of his letters, he says, "For this I was appointed a preacher and an apostle." And I'm telling the truth, I'm not lying. "A teacher of the Gentiles in faith and truth." And we just have to know, who was he appointed by? Because, I mean, this is one thing that you do have to be willing to admit, that he was not appointed an apostle by the original core group of members, okay? And so that's like I have here. It says one thing to keep in mind is that even though other men vouched for Paul, he was never appointed an apostle by the original apostles themselves. We do want to keep that in mind. I think it's important. Now, I'm not against Paul, but I'm going to be very transparent when it comes to details like this, okay? I want to read one more verse before I really get into it. "For I would have you know, brothers, that the gospel that was preached by me, it's not man's gospel, for I did not receive it from any man, nor was I taught it, but I received it through a revelation of Jesus Christ." And that's in Galatians. And so, I mean, that sounds like a good thing. I got it from God himself or Jesus Christ himself. However you look at, Godhead theology. I know some people believe Jesus is the incarnation of the Father. I believe he was a man sent by God, and we don't have to get into that, but I do believe he was an anointed man who was sent to, he was the prophet that was sent, that was prophesied to Moses, Deuteronomy 18, who came from their brethren, like he said. But let's look at this. Paul missed out on a lot of teaching directly from Yeshua, like the other apostles, okay? So a lot of his conclusions were incomplete at best. I mean, he had to come to his own conclusions on some things. He didn't spend 3 years with the rabbi, okay? There were some things he had to come to on his own, all right? So I'm just going to leave that up for a minute. Now, this section, it continues where we were talking in the book, where I was talking about the Ebionites. And if you have followed any of my videos, then you'll know that the Ebionites were one of those groups who, they were basically the Essenes continued. They accepted the message of Yeshua and his convictions, his gospel message, and they were around during the first century, okay? And one of the reasons that they were forgotten is because their beliefs did not measure up to the victor of Christian history, okay? And it's commonly recognized that the Ebionites rejected Paul as a legitimate apostle. And naturally, anyone who disagrees with the dominating religious party, they're going to be marked heretics, okay? Paul is who the Catholic Church chose when they were canonizing scripture, all right? And according to Paul's standards, anyone who didn't preach that same theology as him, they should be cursed for preaching a, quote, different gospel, okay? But again, it's only by Paul's standards and people who agreed with him, all right? So, yeah, sure, that's why the Ebionites were marked heretics. They did preach different things than Paul. And knowing that the New Testament was canonized by men and not God, it makes sense why Paul's letters were chosen over his contemporaries who disagreed on certain points. So if you give an honest look at the circumstances here, it really is peculiar that Paul's letters were chosen, especially over Clement's writings. Clement was Peter's traveling companion, as a lot of people have recognized. He was Peter's buddy. He wrote a lot of things that Peter talked about and a lot of things that he witnessed himself, okay? He was closer to the inner circle of apostles than Paul was. And Paul arrived on the scene a lot later, and he was known for disputing with these apostles. And so you would think that someone of Clement's standing would be a more credible source for information. I mean, wouldn't it make sense to side with a friend of Peter the Rock, the man that Yeshua personally entrusted to carry on the message, rather than someone who opposed Peter on multiple occasions? I mean, it makes sense to me why they should have chosen Clement's writings instead of Paul's. For me personally, the recognitions, the homilies, they really have become somewhat of a book of Enoch to me, just like the Gospel of the Holy 12 and the Essene Gospel. They fill in the gaps of this hidden storyline. It's like I talked about in Beyond the Bible, that series. And just like First Enoch, or the book of 1 Enoch, as some people call it, there are like 3 copies, and you want the one that has the number 1 in front of it. It doesn't mean there are 3 different, like, it's not like John's letters, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. It's like there's this one, there's the number 2, and then there's number 3. They don't have anything to do with each other. Okay, but Enoch, it does shed a considerable amount of light on the story of these rebellious angels. And so what you have here is a book that fills in the gaps. And it's no different with Clement. He fills in the gaps. He provides that backlight for early Jewish Christianity, anti-sacrificial beliefs, vegetarianism, all during the 1st century. And so, I mean, if you study the book of Enoch, you'll understand why I make that comparison. It's not the content that I'm comparing to Clement. I'm just saying that the role that each book plays in filling in the gaps of different storylines, okay? The fact that these books fill in gaps of biblical history, that's what makes them valuable, okay? And so I find the Clementine writings to be even more beneficial than Paul's epistles for understanding what the earliest Jewish Christians believed during the 1st century, okay? When it comes to our opinion of Paul, we have to consider that not all people today believe the same doctrines, okay? I feel like people need to look at Paul as a person, an individual, just like a pastor today. There are different pastors, all right? That's why there are thousands of Christian denominations. A pastor of a local church might go his entire life believing the same teachings of popular Christianity, or he might change his views about certain doctrines over the course of time. It's just part of growing and learning. We understand that pastors across the board may be teaching their own perceptions of the gospel without realizing that some things they say may not be true. And for some reason, most Bible believers assume that Paul somehow downloaded Yeshua's entire mental hard drive in that single blinding moment of his conversion. We we assume that he acquired a complete revelation of the gospel instantaneously. People like pro-Paul people that think, Paul's letters are the infallible word of God. They assume that Paul just knows everything. Like everything he says is true. But people fail to realize that conversion is only the beginning stage of discipleship. That blinding moment, whatever his experience was, that was just step one. Okay. And I've noticed that some people they're so firm in their pro-Paul stance that they tend to elevate him above other contemporary writers like Clement because his background in Judaism and their attitude, it's likely driven by their disdain for anti-Paul proponents. But much of it has to do with the knowledge Paul possessed as a teacher of the law. They believe his education pre-qualified him to preach the gospel. And since it's assumed that Yeshua came to reinstate every letter of scribal law, they believe that Paul was chosen because he was willing to do the same. They don't accept that a pivotal shift occurred through Yeshua's ministry or that he exposed the law and the religious leaders. That people don't think Yeshua came and changed things. They think he came and reverted everyone back to Sinai. That's what people think happens. No, he was continuing the process. He was continuing to lead people where God wanted to lead people from Sinai to begin with, back to the garden. Okay, people have the wrong destination in mind. And because of that, it's people believe, or they don't believe rather, that anything changed. When Yeshua came, they don't think that anything changed as a matter of legal observance. How you look at the law and obey the law. So since people believe that Yeshua and Paul preached nothing different than what was established through Moses at Sinai, that's why people assume that Paul only needed to acknowledge Yeshua as the Messiah to be qualified. Is any of this making sense? Basically, people have this distorted view of Torah because of Hebrew roots theology. Yeshua came to reinstate every law in the book of Leviticus, Moses, even the sacrificial system, everything. He came to renew everything. And they think, well, Paul was the same way. He thought the same thing. He just needed to accept that Yeshua was the promised Messiah so that he could continue where Yeshua left off and tell people they need to obey the law. Okay, it's not like that. People it's like they're unwilling to understand that they don't even want to consider Paul had to go through his own paradigm shift. Okay, that's why there was such a big deal. That's why he was having such a hard time with Yeshua, because Yeshua was teaching something different than what Paul understood. Yeshua was not coming to reinstate these sacrificial laws. Okay, he came to challenge it, and that's why Paul had a problem. All right, because Yeshua was saying, no, don't do these things. And, Paul thought it just like the other Pharisees, it's blasphemy, Paul had to go through his own paradigm shift. He had to unlearn a lifetime of bad doctrine and religious tradition. He had to recognize the difference between eternal law, the law of creation, and scribal law, the man-made Levitical laws that he had succumbed to his whole life. Okay? And when you begin to question Paul as an individual, it can lead down some interesting rabbit holes. And, I think there are some good arguments that come from both sides, whether you're pro-Paul or anti-Paul. But from a pro position, it's basically said that if you throw out Paul, you have to throw out Luke. You'll hear that if you people who are pro-Paul. They're like, well, if you're going to throw him out, then you'll have to get rid of Paul. And that leads down the slippery slope of throwing out the Bible, then denying the Messiah. It's because people, they say, well, Luke was Paul's disciple, which I don't think he was Paul's disciple. I think he spent some time with Paul, but I disagree with that whole premise, because Luke's writings reveal that he was already closer to the original apostle, all the apostles, the original circle, that ring of those pillars, the foundation of this movement, than Paul was. He was closer to them than Paul was. So, and it's true that Paul was together with Luke on multiple occasions, but Luke's writings are more detailed, and they offer a narrative that could only be captured either by personal affiliation with Yeshua as one of the original 70, or his associations with people who knew Yeshua personally. Okay, and so we're going to look at one passage that comes from Luke's Gospel. I can't remember why I wrote this. What was I going to say here? Why is Paul known for being the most prominent apostle of all time? I think that had to do with what I was talking about earlier. Talking about the Catholic Church and who they decide what makes for the best historical narrative, religious narrative written by the victors. I was going to go somewhere with that, but let's look at Luke's Gospel according to this Syriac manuscript, okay? And I put credit to James Bean for finding this. And he's another researcher who looks into first century vegetarianism in the gospel. But look here, it says, "Be on guard so that your hearts do not become heavy with the eating of flesh." And according to the KJV, it just says surfeiting, overindulgence, and with the intoxication of wine and with the anxiety of the world. Okay, so I think that's really neat that there is a Syriac manuscript that it hasn't been corrupted by the Catholic Church. All right, it has this. It says the eating of flesh. Don't become heavy with the eating of flesh. It's not just overindulgence of the flesh; it's eating the flesh itself. Okay, so I think that's pretty neat. The evidence is there. It comes up all the time. It seeps through the cracks, and we find it in writings like this. And we know that early followers of Yeshua were not just aware of the vegetarian principle. They understood that it was largely a part of the gospel message. And I guess to Paul's credibility, he seems to selectively understand this. And it's something I wanted to look at, right here. He does say it is good neither to eat flesh, nor to drink wine, nor anything whereby thy brother stumbleth, or is offended, or is made weak. And we'll go back to this first, but there's a reason that he says that. Whatever your brother, if it makes your brother stumble, then don't do it. That's why I say he's selective about it. It's because, if don't do it only if you're offending someone. But, aside from any opposing interpretation of this statement, it is evident that flesh eating was a matter of controversy among the first century church. And for now, that's the point. It's not just how meat was handled, whether it was kosher or not, but the meat itself, whether an individual should consume it. And if you give a look at the context, Paul begins this entire discussion here by claiming that weak people eat vegetables only, while other people believe it's perfectly acceptable to eat anything or all things. And you guys know the verse because people use it against us all the time. Okay, as for the one who is weak in faith, welcome him, but not to quarrel over opinions. One person believes he may eat anything, while the weak person eats only vegetables. How many times have had somebody throw that clause of scripture at you to say that you're weak in the faith, or that, just kind of to hold that, they want the higher position. They want to be, the authority, the spiritual superior over you because of this one single statement. To say that, you vegetarians, you vegans are wrong. You're not following Scripture. Look what Paul said. But he goes on. He says, let not the one who eats despise the one who abstains, and let not the one who abstains pass judgment on the one who eats, for God has welcomed him. And, depending on the person's theological position or their dietary conviction, that this passage, it has become the center of debate between Christians, Torah keepers, flesh eaters, and vegans for many years. You got all kinds of parties going back and forth between each other. But, since we're not addressing whether certain animals have been made clean or not, that's not what we're arguing today. That's what Christians and Torah folks would get to this passage, and that's what they would be talking about. No, it's more about contending whether flesh should be consumed at all. And people have challenged me with this passage. And obviously, if Paul considers vegetarians to be weaklings, then it proves that we should consume flesh, right? No, not exactly. Not at all. As much as people emphasize that statement, it ignores the focal point. Whatever a person chooses to eat, don't pass judgment on them. In my experience, flesh eaters, they tend to make themselves the victims in this whole debate. They single out that statement right here. Let not the one who abstains pass judgment on the one who eats. They totally ignore this right here. Look at this. Let not the one who eats pass judgment on the one who abstains. They totally ignore that, and they go straight to this. Let not the one who abstains pass judgment on the ones who eats. So they'll say, you vegans need to shut up because you need to quit passing judgment on us for eating meat. And it's like, have you not heard the nasty things that flesh eaters will say to vegans? I don't even need to go there, but I know a lot of you who are listening know a lot of the things that people have said to me, like I'm a blasphemer for teaching this. It goes really deep. I'm worshiping the devil. I'm teaching satanic doctrine, teaching a doctrine of devils, all kind of things. But anyway, people, they just pull out different bits and pieces from this verse. They cherry pick. I'm looking at the whole thing. And I'm telling you, the point that he's making here is just whatever you do, don't pass judgment. Like I said, people, they focus on the part that favors their position, but Paul's just saying, abstain from eating flesh or drinking wine if it causes your brother to stumble. And most meat eaters don't want to hear that. And that's why I'll go back to the passage here, Romans 14:21, the verse we looked at a few minutes ago. That's why he said it's neither good to eat flesh or drink wine or anything that causes your brother to stumble. Okay, so he's basically saying don't do it if it offends someone. All right. So one thing I want to point out here is that I do think it's interesting that he also talks about wine in this statement, because it was widely known that early Jewish Christians, or the Nazarene or the Ebionites, they didn't consume alcoholic beverages. And that correlates with other parts of Scripture, be not among heavy drinkers of wine, with gluttonous eaters of flesh. Okay. So even though Paul, he may have held to different convictions, I believe he ate meat in many occasions. His epistle here, it strongly suggests that he was defending the Ebionites, or at least he was attempting to make peace between both parties, Gentile Christians who consumed flesh and alcohol, and the Jewish Christians who abstained. Okay. And it would make sense because Paul, he was focused on spreading the gospel to the Gentiles. And so for him to criticize the original followers of Yeshua, that would really give the wrong impression for the people that he was trying to disciple. And I do believe Paul was at least level-headed enough to show respect to his elders. And, you see that in other examples in the book of Acts, where he was just showing respect to the elders and the priests. So that's what I think is going on here. You know, Paul's just making peace with the Ebionites and his Gentile followers. He's saying, you know, that's why we want to, you know, don't pass judgment on anything. You guys will eat the way you eat. They will eat the way they eat. Okay? He was trying to create peace. And I think Paul was careful to give honor where honor was due. I believe that he did make efforts to keep unity among the Ebionite community and the Gentile converts. So in his epistle to Rome, what we just looked at, I mean, it's, should we think Paul was saying vegetarians are literally weak? Well, maybe he was. But if so, if that's what Paul was saying there, it only proves that it was Paul's opinion. You know, like I told you the point that he was making was that just keep peace between you all. Don't judge each other, all right? But if that statement that Paul made was literally to say vegetarians are weak, then, like I said, it's only Paul's opinion, okay? And a lot of people think that he was speaking of a sensitive conscience, not literal weakness or even weak faith. But I've heard a lot of different interpretations of that statement. These vegetarians are weak in the faith, or they have a sensitive conscience. But either way, in the bigger picture, Paul was well-versed in the scriptures, and he most likely understood that it's better to have a meal of vegetables where there is love rather than a fattened calf with hatred. I mean, Paul got that. He understood that. So that's why all he was doing was trying to prevent division among the believers. And it's as simple as that. But if he was calling vegetarians weak, so what? Who cares about his opinion on that matter? What does Yeshua say? That's the ultimate thing. You know, let's look at Yeshua. At the same time, throughout all of this, Paul was beginning to form a movement of his own. And so consequently, there were inevitable disagreements waiting to surface among these diverse groups. There was tension between Paul and the core group of Jewish Christians. So we should expect times when Paul felt compelled to follow peace with all men, like he says in one case, but then there were other times when he clashed with certain apostles and he acted on his personal feelings. He was human after all, okay, guys? So that's the point. There are times when, you know, just like us, we feel sometimes like we have it in our heart because to be good people, and then other times our emotions get the best of us. And we will, you know, we'll snap at somebody if they say something dumb, you know. But we got to remember that Paul was not a part of the original inner ring of apostles. That's what we got to remember. I'm going to look at this again, okay, guys? For I would have you know, I didn't receive this teaching from any man. I received it through revelation. All right. He arrived on the scene much later, and it appears that he formed his own slant on the gospel. He believed that his experience was just as, or if not more, he believed that it was probably even more authoritative than the men who were originally sent out by Yeshua himself. Okay, and that's why when he says this here, you know, think about that statement. The original apostles, they spent 3 years under their rabbi learning from him. They were taught the gospel by the man named Yeshua. And up here, Paul says, I didn't learn the gospel by any man. I came to my own conclusions, basically. I received it through a revelation of Jesus Christ. That's what he says. But like I said, he had one blinding experience. And then after that, every conclusion he came to was just that, a conclusion that he came to. He did not download everything from Yeshua's entire ministry in that single blinding moment. That experience that he had is not equivalent to the 3 years that he spent with the apostles, okay? And that's where people are wrong. They act like everything that he had taught the apostles, Paul learned in that one moment. So, no, whatever happened in that experience, It was just Paul coming to the realization that Yeshua is who he said he was, the Son of God, the Messiah. So, and that's the point. But like I said, he didn't learn about the gospel from the original core group of apostles or Yeshua himself. He received it from personal revelation. Now, a lot of people think this is a problem because of the differences between his beliefs and the beliefs of the original apostles, and the fact that there is a growing number of anti-Paul proponents today. It does attest to the reality that there is at least some difference between Paul's message and the message of Yeshua. And that's one thing that I can respect about the anti-Paul movement, is that they are willing to look at these differences and say, yeah, Paul was teaching something different, okay? Or could it be also that Paul's message, it does agree with Yeshua, while anti-Paulites misunderstand Yeshua himself? Maybe it's both, okay? And I'm going to go down each of these different, I'm going to show you a few different things that what I'm saying here, it's going to make sense, all right? I'm not an anti-Paulite. I don't believe he was a false apostle, as a lot of people would say, but it doesn't mean that I think he was a legitimate apostle either, okay? From my understanding, I think it's most consistent to say that he was a self-appointed apostle, all right? He was a man with his own take on the gospel message, just like any denominational preacher today. And he likely desired the status quo of the core apostles so much that he identified himself as an apostle on multiple occasions. I mean, like I said, Paul missed out on many of the firsthand teachings of Yeshua, and he converted to the way much later than his contemporaries, okay? So he did have a lot of catching up to do, theologically speaking. All right. And so realistically, Paul may have come to different conclusions and formed his own beliefs about certain matters, just like individuals today who were introduced to various aspects of history and religion. Paul was no different. Okay. Ultimately, the conclusions that we form today may not agree with other Christians or Torah believers. Okay. But most of the time, we can agree that Yeshua is the Messiah and that we have to seek further truth on that foundation, okay? And Paul, even though some of his conclusions may fail to line up with the other apostles, he proclaimed the truth of Yeshua as the promised Messiah anyway. He proclaimed that Yeshua was the Messiah. He proclaimed the resurrection. And so his theology may not have always agreed with the other New Testament writers, but he was genuinely determined to spread the gospel according to his understanding. Okay, and that's a good thing. All right. Now, like I said, the anti-Paulite movement today, they're at least honest enough to admit that some of Paul's writings clash with popular Hebrew roots ideology. Okay, and I think it's beneficial to entertain many of those arguments solely for the purpose of exercising our theological gears. That's what I did. I did like a 6-part series a few years ago where I looked at a lot of these arguments, and it really made me think about what life was like in the first century and why they would have disagreed, what was going on here. So I think it's a good study either way. Okay, but because since people can't recognize the difference between the eternal law, the law of creation, the law of the Father, our Creator, versus the man-made laws, the scribal laws, a lot of anti-Paulites, they just assume that Paul preached against the Torah. And because of this, they form inadequate conclusions about Paul's writings. Just like Peter said, he said it's due to the unstable foundation. Okay, so but in the opposing corner, people who accept Paul as a legitimate apostle they tend to interpret his letters as if everything he writes agrees with the other apostles, which that's not true. The New Testament, who said it? I think it was Keith Akers who said it. He said the New Testament is a book about disagreements. Or I can't remember how exactly he said it, but he said it's a book about different men who spread the gospels who disagreed with each other and how they handled their disagreements. I thought that was good, but because it is. But just like different beliefs and opinions can be seen today from different teachers of the law, Christian pastors, it was no different during the first century. It just appears that it seems like Paul, he was convinced that Yeshua was the Messiah, but he also held to his own convictions, and he had his own interpretation of certain laws, all right? All right, hopefully I'm not rambling. I know this is a long study. We're only going to get through half of it today. But like I said, getting back to this, there was a lot of new ideology surfacing among the early Jesus movement during the first century. There were some things that Paul simply refused to embrace, like perpetually abstaining from flesh eating. He just couldn't get that. He refused to embrace that position. In some instances, his writings appear to be in favor of vegetarianism, while other times he appears to endorse the consumption of meat. And maybe his position, and this is what I think, it was simply to appease the different parties that he was around. And, you know, at the same time, I believe some of the major aspects of Yeshua's message were unmistakably understood by Paul. Paul got it when it came to the more common teachings of Yeshua, challenges against the law. Paul understood this. And so I want it to be very clear that when it came to sacrificial law, now I'm not talking about flesh eating. And I know the whole purpose for the sacrificial system, when it was established at Sinai, it was to regulate the flesh eating of the Israelites who needed it. By the time Paul enters the scene, or Yeshua later on, when Yeshua and Paul are around, right? It's been years later, and so it's become a business. It's become it turned into an atonement system by the Levites. Back during the time, throughout time, the sacrificial system was used for different things, and you'll see that in the law. It became like they incorporated this atonement system with it so that it would have some type of religious value. Okay, they didn't want to. They knew that just killing animals for the purpose of eating them, they didn't really have a justifiable reason to do that. So they made it into part of their religion. And if you can say something should be done in the name of Yahuwah or your God, your creator, and it's a part of your religious service, then you can justify it. And you can say, that's why so many people are deceived today, and they think, oh, God commanded us to kill animals. Well, they're being duped by the people who wrote that into the law, who made it a part of their religious service to God. Okay? And if you can do that, if you can make an act of immorality into something that is required by your religion, and it's written in a book of law that you have deemed your authority, then people are going to believe that it is required by God. And so let's look at these few statements that Paul made. This phrase, it's one of the more common Pauline expressions. It is a direct challenge against the law. And if you've been in the Torah community for very long, then you will know that people will explain away this phrase under the law and say that it is only referring to the penalty of the law. Okay? Paul says here in Romans 6:14, sin will have no dominion over you. You are not under the law, but under grace. And then he says in Galatians 5:18, but if you are led by the Spirit, you are not under the law. Okay, it's self-evident. I think Christians understand this. I was raised in church, and I let this phrase speak for itself. It's like Christians understand what this means. I'm not saying they have it all together or understand the entire theology, but they are at least level-headed enough to know that this phrase means what it says at face value. We're not under the law. Okay, when you give an honest look at the phrase, it is evident that Paul was referring to this system itself, not the penalty of the law. He is referring to that system, the law itself. And I know, when coming into Torah, you have to train yourself to approach this phrase under the persuasion of penalty until it is ingrained in your mind enough to make sense. The problem is that even on the surface, this phrase is self-explanatory. And that's why so many Torah adherents today become anti-Paul, because they see the conflict between their existing paradigm and the anti-legal writings of Paul. So considering that his focus is about sin not having dominion over us, I think it's self-evident. He literally meant that we are no longer accountable to the man-made system of blood atonement as it is seen in the law. Why? Because it's not possible for the blood of bulls or goats to take away sins. Okay? Through Yeshua's ministry, the sacrificial system was exposed, and Paul understood that forgiveness was freely given without the shedding of blood. Okay? So, understanding that Yeshua came to abolish scribal law, the sacrificial system, and restore the law of creation, the Father's eternal law, it makes sense why Paul stated that we are no longer under the law, but under grace. Okay? Torah believers, they'll criticize Christians for their interpretation of this statement, but in this case, the Torah community is mistaken about this matter. Modern Christianity has it right. Their interpretations, they understand what Paul was saying at face value. It's self-explanatory. We're not under that system. We're under the system of grace. Okay? Christians today, it's like they understand the difference between moral law and ceremonial law, but Torah believers, they conveniently dismiss, or they will argue against that. And there's one more I want to look at. It says, for he himself is our peace, who has made us both one and has broken down in his flesh the dividing wall of hostility by doing what? By abolishing the law of commandments expressed in ordinances, that he might create in himself one new man in place of the two, so making peace, and that it might reconcile us both to God in one body through the cross, thereby killing the hostility. Okay? And so I've listened to others dance around this statement as if they don't see the problem, They don't see, but ultimately when modern Torah believers, when they endeavor to explain Paul's epistles, it causes even more confusion because they assume that everything in the Bible must align with popular Hebrew roots theology, which goes back to Sinai, thinking that God demanded these sacrifices. But it's popular theology. That's the central issue. Regarding animal sacrifice, I think Paul correctly understood the gospel message when it came to blood atonement, sacrifices. We're not under the law anymore. Like the other apostles, Paul learned the difference between scribal law and eternal law, okay? The disconnect, it's where he stood on consuming flesh, okay? So it appears that he only denounced the sacrificial aspect of the law, the blood atonement, but not the dietary aspect, consuming the animal flesh, okay? So that's my position on Paul. It's like I think he understood that blood atonement is no more sacrifice for these religious rituals. They're not valuable. They are not spiritually valuable. But he never came fully to understand that he shouldn't be eating these animals. So if you think about it, it's not much different than most people's view today in Christianity. Whether, they think, oh yeah, the general consensus basically is that blood atonement is no longer applicable. But most people who understand this are meat eaters, right? It's like people can recognize just how unreasonable it is to think the blood of bulls can take away our sins, but they can't seem to grasp the immoral nature of eating the flesh of bulls. So, and that's the view that most Bible believers today have, but it seems to resemble Paul's understanding. Okay. And so that's why Paul was chosen by the Catholic Church. It's like he basically started this view. Okay, blood atonement rituals, saved by blood is no longer a thing. The blood of bulls, right? No more. But eating flesh, yeah, it's okay. And so that's why. It's because that's Paul's position. That's why the Catholic Church chose him, because he does seem to condone flesh eating. Except the times that he's around certain people and he says, hold off, right? The only difference between popular ideology and the true gospel message is that Yeshua came to expose the entire system and to reveal that blood atonement never held any spiritual value, right? And some might question why Paul would have been called to spread the gospel if God knew that he would never come to the full revelation of eliminating flesh from his diet. But when you use that mentality, it's no different than asking why God gave Adam and Eve the opportunity to overcome the temptation of the forbidden fruit if he knew they would fail too. Like, I'm sure a lot of people feel called by God, by the Father, Yahuwah, our Creator, but there are many different gospel messages and versions of the Torah that are being preached today, okay? It doesn't determine who is or who is not called by God. It doesn't determine who's qualified by God. It just demonstrates that some people advance further in their understanding while others are only willing to embrace partial truths, like Paul did. He only embraced the atonement aspect, that it was no longer necessary, but he couldn't come to that full revelation of, abstaining from animal flesh. A lot of people today, they're more active than others when it comes to evangelism. They may not have the full truth, but they do have they're proactive. And I think that's what God saw in Paul. He was willing to use him simply because he was a determined individual. That's the good thing about Paul. Does God only use people who come to a full revelation of truth? Well, I think if that were the case, then we would all be in bad shape. He wouldn't use any of us. So ultimately, Paul had just as much opportunity during his ministry to realize that his indecisiveness about flesh eating was problematic. He should have come to that revelation, but he didn't. And hence the reason that it's brought up on multiple occasions throughout his epistles, right? The fact that Paul could have changed, but didn't. So as you're going to see, he chose to remain somewhere in the middle when it comes to flesh eating. Today, it's the reason it's so confusing today. We have multiple factors that have collided all at once, and that's what increases the confusion for interpreting Paul. First, people assume that Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible, and they discount the possibility that scribes were involved, that it was a multifaceted effort to have an account of history by, chapter 9. Chapter 9 goes over that Moses didn't write the Pentateuch, okay? All right? Second, people assume that Yeshua believed the Pentateuch was written by Moses and that it is completely authentic. That's another problem. And third, people today believe that Yeshua upheld every jot and tittle of scribal law, man-made law, when what he upheld was the Father's eternal law. Okay, he exposed the scribal laws. Okay, and fourth, people believe that Paul's writings agree with all of the 3 previous misconceptions. So do you see why there's so much confusion? Our approach to Paul assumes that we can interpret every one of his statements as if it were in complete agreement with our faulty understanding of Torah, who wrote it, the purpose for sacrificial laws, things like that. And then we want to discount Jeremiah's exposure to this, when he said, the scribes have made the law into a lie. And we want to discount that. So we remain in those lies. And it's just a mess, guys. But when you come into Torah for the first time, you're introduced to the most common interpretation methods of the New Testament. And this was my experience. All of my friends, it's their experience. It's just what you'll find when you're coming out of Christianity into Torah. One of the methods is to approach any given passage under the assumption that Yeshua must have observed every written letter of the law, right? Otherwise, he couldn't have truly been the Messiah. That's a problem, guys. We believe that Yeshua's obedience to Torah was consistent with our modern misconceptions of Torah. And it's true that he was perfect in several ways, including his observance to the Father's eternal instructions. But it doesn't mean that he kept certain laws according to what we believe today, how we perceive Torah. It means that he observed Torah according to his understanding of Torah. And what most people can't accept or embrace is that it is different than your misconception of Torah, okay? The idea that the Messiah must have done this or that simply because it's stated in the law, that whole mentality has misguided most of the modern Hebrew roots movement. It's speculation based on skewed perceptions of the law. And people who are honest enough to acknowledge those inconsistencies, they tend to question the New Testament writings to the point that they end up becoming anti-Paul because of that. They're not anti-Paul for a legitimate reason. Now, people who are anti-Paul for legitimate reasons, yeah, I can respect that. And I have some friends who are anti-Paul, and it's legit why they are anti-Paul. Okay? But other people, they're anti-Paul for illegitimate reasons because they have a distorted perception of Torah, the purpose of Yeshua, why Yeshua came, and what his ministry was, okay? But people, it's like most of the anti-Paul proponents, their loyalty remains true to the Torah in so much that they throw out Paul in efforts to demonstrate their allegiance to Yahuwah, okay? But again, it's only because of modern misconceptions about what constitutes law, okay? And, the further you explore the invention of popular Christianity, the more you're going to see that it's not just a matter of upholding or destroying the law. And that's why a lot of Torah believers, they have a tough time understanding this storyline that I present in Shifting the Torah Paradigm. It's because it's more than a dichotomy of observation versus abolition. Do we observe the law or was the law abolished? It's a lot deeper than that, guys. It's not the simple battle of Christianity versus Torah. It's not law versus grace. There are so many more factors that have been overlooked. And, that's the one good thing is that I believe what I've written in here fills in a lot of the gaps and helps you understand a lot of those missing details, okay? And the vegan communities, the vegetarian communities within Christianity, they have uncovered many of those pieces also, the information that fills in those gaps. And of course, that also would create another hindrance for Torah observers because usually people in Torah, they are unwilling to consider information coming from Christians because it's assumed that Torah keepers are closer to the truth than traditional Christianity, right? And that's what I've noticed anyway. When people come into Torah, they begin to look at themselves as theologically superior to Christians. So in effect, they become spiritual elitists. They believe that they have arrived at a fuller revelation of the law, and they can no longer be taught unless they learn from someone who's recognized in certain circles of Hebrew roots, right? And that's a problem. The Hebrew roots movement has compartmentalized itself in so much that any outside information from Christianity is deemed incredible, whether it's true or not, okay? But the Christian vegan movement, it has created a powerful wave of clarification to sweep across the earth over the past few decades. That's how I came to it. You know, I read some things from Christians who it just really helped me. And it came from the Christian community. And I think it's because a lot of Christians understand Torah observance much clearer than the Torah community itself. Anyway, I really think I need to stop there. But we're going to get into some other things. We're going to look at, let's see, what's this last verse I had here? We're going to get into some more things later. I do have to cut it off. Like I said, we will go to part 2 next week. But for now, there's just a lot to consider here. We're scrutinizing Paul. Well, guys, thanks for watching. I'll pick back up right where I left off, and we'll finish this thing out. Overall, I think Paul was just a little flaky about his flesh eating. Okay, I think that's a good word for Paul. Flaky Paul. So I'll talk to you guys later.